The thick, beige foundation didn't just cover the skin. It filled the deep, violet craters left by a heavy signet ring, masking the evidence of a holy wrath. Janice McCall stared into the cracked vanity mirror, hammering the pigment into her jaw until the metallic tang of blood in her mouth was the only thing left to remind her of the night before. Outside, the church bells of Oak Creek began to toll, a sound that usually signaled peace, but now felt like the rhythmic pounding of a judge's gavel. She adjusted her high lace collar, ensuring not a sliver of the truth remained visible, before stepping out to face the man the town called a saint. The silence of the art studio was shattered when Claire, the youngest girl in the congregation, reached for a brush and her oversized sleeve slid back. Janice froze, her gaze locking onto a constellation of bruises on the girl's forearm that were identical to the ones hidden beneath her own floral dress. At that moment, the smell of turpentine and linseed oil turned acrid, and the heavy thud of boots echoed in the hallway outside. Janice realized that the paintings drying on the easels weren't just art. They were the only maps out of a town where the most dangerous place to be was behind a locked door with a man of God. Janice McCall froze before the vanity, her reflection fractured by a hairline crack that ran through the glass like a jagged lightning bolt. The bathroom lamp overhead hummed a low, erratic tune, casting harsh, unforgiving shadows across her sunken cheeks. She gripped a sponge saturated with a thick beige paste, a heavy theatrical foundation designed to mask the most stubborn imperfections. With short, rhythmic, and frantic movements, Janice hammered the pigment into her skin. She forced herself to remain silent, though each dab sent a pulse of white-hot agony through her jaw where Eli's heavy ring had connected with her bone the night before. Under the cooling layer of chemicals, a bloom of deep indigo and sickly violet vanished. The cream filled the pores and smoothed the uneven terrain of her swelling. But her anatomy betrayed her. Every breath sent a throb through her teeth. She tilted her head, scrutinizing the angle of the light, ensuring no trace of the violence remained. Only when the metallic tang of blood in her mouth was overwhelmed by the cloying, floral scent of cheap powder did she allow her shoulders to drop. Eli McCall occupied the head of the dining table as if it were a throne, his large, calloused hands resting heavily upon the leather binding of the Holy Bible. His voice didn't just carry. It rumbled, a subsonic frequency that made the silver teaspoons dance in their saucers. Janice sat directly across from him, her chin tucked so low she could see nothing but the stray crumbs on the lace tablecloth and the terrifyingly perfect polish of her husband's shoes. Eli spoke of dust and the inherent duty of submission, his tenor rising and falling with the practiced cadence of a man who believed his words were the literal breath of God. He punctuated every sentence with a heavy stare, emphasizing the frailty of the feminine spirit. The air in the kitchen felt thick, saturated with the smell of starch and the oppressive weight of his presence. When Eli paused to breathe, the ensuing silence pressed against Janice's eardrums with more force than any shout. In that quiet, she felt herself truly disappear, a ghost haunted by the living man across from her. Eli slowly rotated a silver fountain pen between his thick fingers, his gaze fixed on the handwritten proposal for the community arts circle. Janice stood at the edge of the Persian rug, her hands clasped behind her back so tightly that her knuckles turned the color of bone. She didn't move, didn't blink, waiting for the verdict. Eli took a deliberate sip of his lukewarm coffee, the ceramic clinking against his teeth, before he scrawled a sprawling, aggressive signature at the bottom of the page. To Janice, the sound of that nib scratching against the paper was the unmistakable clang of a prison gate being unbolted. Eli looked up, his eyes dark and unreadable, as he delivered a brief lecture on how art must serve as a vessel for the faith of the community sisters. Janice nodded, a mechanical gesture of gratitude, while a foreign warmth bloomed in her chest. Beneath the fabric of her skirt, Her fingers unconsciously mimicked the sweeping motion of a brush against an imaginary canvas. Janice heaved the windows of the church annex upward, the old wood groaning as it yielded to the morning. A rush of Arkansas summer flooded the room, carrying the scent of sun-baked grass and the sharp, medicinal tang of pine resin. The rhythmic scrape of easel legs against the uneven floorboards filled the space, a percussion of progress. She moved with a lightness she hadn't felt in decades, arranging jars of linseed oil and laying out rows of soft, bristled brushes. There was a profound peace in the absence of Eli's heavy footfalls. A stray beam of sunlight caught the dust motes dancing in the air, and Janice closed her eyes for a fleeting second, offering her face to the warmth. Here, enveloped by the smell of turpentine and raw linen, she finally stopped looking over her shoulder. The usual constriction in her chest loosened. The invisible leash Eli held had finally been granted a few hours of slack. The women of Oak Creek crossed the threshold of the studio with the tentative steps of trespassers. They clutched their aprons to their chests, eyes darting toward the corners of the room as if expecting a trap. Janice moved among them, pouring steaming peppermint tea into mismatched ceramic mugs, hoping the rising vapor would soften the brittle tension etched into their faces. The room took on a new atmosphere, smelling of dried herbs and freshly sawn wood. Janice reached out, her hand barely grazing Mrs. Watts's shoulder as she guided the older woman toward a chair near the window. For a long time, there was only the sound of soft sighs and the rustle of cotton dresses. Then, a spoon clinked against a saucer. A whisper broke the silence. When one of the younger women let out a sudden, nervous titter of laughter, Janice felt the first crack in the ice of their shared isolation. She smiled back, a genuine expression that felt like weaving a fragile cocoon of safety around them all. Claire Wilson entered the studio last, her slight frame nearly lost in a cardigan far too large for the sweltering afternoon. The girl stood frozen before a blank white square of canvas, her gaze vacant. When she finally reached for a thin sable brush on the high shelf, her hand trembled with a fine, persistent palsy. As her arm extended, the oversized sleeve slid backward toward her elbow, revealing the pale, translucent skin of her forearm. Claire stopped mid-sentence, her breath catching in her throat as the fabric fell away. Janice's eyes locked onto the girl's arm, and the air in the room seemed to vanish. Janice's breath hitched as the brush slipped from Claire's shaking fingers, clattering onto the floor. The sleeve of the girl's cardigan had bunched at the crook of her elbow, exposing a horrific constellation of bruises. Janice didn't just see them. She recognized them. These were the hallmarks of a specific kind of rage. The jagged purple-black indentations left by a heavy signet ring, surrounded by the sickly yellow halo of older, fading pain. Janice's gaze darted around the room, a sudden, sharp clarity piercing her mind. She saw Mrs. Watts reflexively tug at her high lace collar, her eyes wide with a shared, unspoken terror. She saw young Sarah bury her hands deep in the folds of her apron. The air in the studio turned acrid, smelling of spilled mineral spirits and the sudden, suffocating stench of a shared secret. Janice felt a cold, invisible wire pull taut between them all, connecting their broken bodies into a single, agonizing map of Oak Creek's domestic reality. Janice dipped a palette knife into a mound of burnt ochre, dragging the thick pigment across the wood next to a smear of vibrant blue. She didn't look up, her movements appearing casual to any outside observer. With the tip of the knife, she began to tap out tiny, irregular dots and dashes along the very edge of the canvas. Marks that looked like nothing more than accidental splatters. In a voice that was barely a vibration in the air, she explained to the huddle of women that every yellow stroke in the corner of a landscape represented $5 hidden away in flour tins or under floorboards. Claire leaned in, her eyes devouring the movements of Janice's hands, committing the financial cipher to memory. The sudden, sharp clack of heels on the cobblestones outside the window caused Janice to shift her tone instantly. She pivoted from a revolutionary accountant to a demure instructor, lecturing on the interplay of light and shadow while the precious data dried beneath a protective layer of glossy varnish. Claire reached out, offering Janice a heavy tin box coated in a fine layer of black charcoal dust. Janice's fingers delved into the cold, gritty powder, searching past the sticks of willow charcoal until she felt the unmistakable texture of a thick, crisp envelope hidden beneath a false bottom. She moved with practiced stealth, sliding the packet into the lining of her old wool coat hanging by the door. The rough edge of a forged identification card pressed against Janice's thigh through the fabric of her dress, a cold promise of a different life. Claire nodded once, wiping her soot-stained hands on her apron, her expression grim but resolute. Janice took a deep, shuddering breath. The metallic taste of fear was there, but it was eclipsed by the sharp tang of hope. The box no longer held the tools for sketching. It held the first stone of the wall Janice was building to keep them all safe. The studio door didn't just open. It exploded inward, the frame groaning under the force. Eli McCall's massive silhouette filled the entrance, blocking out the afternoon sun. His heavy boots made the floorboards shriek as he began a slow, predatory circuit of the easels. He stopped at Claire's station, leaning over the girl until she was engulfed by the scent of stale tobacco and menthol lozenges. His dark, piercing eyes scanned the canvases, searching for a transgression he could name, a sin he could punish. Janice's fingernails dug into the edge of the wooden table so hard that splinters pierced her skin. But she felt no pain. Eli reached out, his thick index finger dragging through the wet paint on Janice's own canvas. He moved with deliberate malice, obliterating the carefully hidden cipher with a deep, ugly furrow of gray sludge, his gaze never leaving his wife's face. Eli stood on the church pulpit, a titan of righteous fury. His fist descended onto the polished oak panel with a rhythmic, bone-jarring thud that punctuated every sentence. Janice was forced to stand in the center of the main aisle, the weight of 100 judgmental stares pressing against her back like physical weights. Eli's voice rose to a roar, citing scripture about the vanity of the idle mind and comparing the art circle to a demonic infestation within the garden of the Lord. A dry, rattling chuckle rippled through the elders on the front pews, a sound like dead leaves skittering over a grave. Janice stared at her fingernails, still stained with traces of cobalt and earth tones, while Eli's words lashed her skin like wet leather. Each mocking reference to her finger painting caused Janice to pull her shoulders back, her spine turning to steel. The public humiliation didn't break her. It acted as a catalyst, turning her inner turmoil into a cold, diamond-hard rage. Eli stepped into the kitchen just as Janice was on her knees, her hands deep in the shadows of the lower cabinet. Scattered across the linoleum were crumpled dollar bills and a handful of silver coins she had just retrieved from the secret space behind the canned goods. Eli closed the back door with a soft, final click of the deadbolt that sounded like a gunshot to Janice's ears. His shadow stretched across her, cold and absolute. Without a word, he began to unbuckle his heavy leather belt, the brass buckle clinking as he wound the strap around his fist. Janice scrambled to gather the money, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But Eli's heavy boot descended. He crushed her fingers into the floor, grinding the copper and silver coins into the soft flesh of her hand until she heard the sickening pop of a joint. Eli grabbed Janice by the collar of her dress, his knuckles grazing her throat, and threw her toward the stairs with a casual, terrifying strength. She hit the steps hard, her body tumbling until she came to rest on the cold tiles of the entryway. Eli followed, his arms full of her canvases and wooden easels. Before her eyes, he began to systematically destroy her world. He snapped the thin cedar frames over his knee with a sound like breaking bones, the linen ripping with a high-pitched shriek. He tossed the wreckage into the fireplace, and the hungry flames licked the oil paint, turning her vibrant landscapes into a foul-smelling black sludge. Janice clutched her shattered elbow to her chest, her eyes wide as the acrid smoke of her dreams filled the room, stinging her lungs and blurring her vision. Janice pressed her forehead against the chilled window pane, the glass fogging with her frantic breath. In the deepening Arkansas twilight, she could see Claire's slight figure waiting by the garden fence, a shadow among shadows. Janice tried to slide a folded note through the narrow gap of the sash, her fingers trembling. Suddenly, a hand clamped onto her wrist like a steel trap. Eli jerked her backward with such violence that her shoulder socket gave a sharp, sickening crunch. He slammed the window shut and threw the latch with finality. Janice fought against his grip, kicking and clawing, her eyes fixed on the spot where Claire was disappearing into the gloom of the trees. Eli dragged her toward the dark hallway, away from the light and the chance of being seen, his voice a low, terrifying promise of the silence to come. The bedroom door groaned open, admitting Eli and Dr. Miller, a man who carried the suffocating scent of formaldehyde and old leather. Janice recoiled against the headboard, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the doctor extract a gleaming glass syringe from his black bag. Eli's hand descended onto her shoulder, a heavy weight that anchored her to the bed. Dr. Miller flicked the needle, a thin stream of translucent liquid squirting into the air. The room felt smaller, the air turning thick and humid. Eli leaned down, his voice a soothing, horrific murmur about the necessity of peace and the grace of submission. Janice felt the sharp sting as the needle pierced her upper arm. The cold, chemical tide rushed through her veins, and the walls of the room began to undulate, dissolving into a gray, featureless fog. The rhythmic, dull thud of a hammer echoed through Janice's skull, pulling her back from the edge of a drug-induced stupor. She flinched on the tangled sheets, her head swimming. Outside the window, Eli's shadow passed back and forth as he positioned heavy pine boards over the glass. Janice watched, paralyzed, as the slivers of daylight narrowed and then vanished entirely. The final nail bit into the wood with a definitive, metallic ring, plunging the room into a manufactured midnight. The air grew stale, tasting of sawdust and trapped heat. Janice scrambled from the bed, her feet stumbling over the rug, and clawed at the rough surface of the boards until her fingernails bled. She heard Eli's footsteps retreating down the hall, each step a further distancing from the world. She was entombed in a wooden box, the silence of the house magnified by the pulse thumping in her ears. Janice pressed her ear to the cold wood of the bedroom door, straining to catch the booming resonance of Eli's voice coming from the parlor below. He was rehearsing his anniversary sermon, his cadence sharp and practiced as he spoke of the purity of the flock and the need to prune the chaff from the wheat. Janice heard him promise the town a grand cleansing of the spirit during the upcoming Jubilee. The scratch of his pen against the parchment sounded like a blade being honed on a whetstone. She understood with a chilling certainty that she and the women of the circle were the chaff he intended to burn. Every word Eli uttered confirmed that the time for quiet resistance had passed. The Jubilee would be the day of their final erasure or their only chance at a messy, violent birth into freedom. Janice dropped to her knees, her fingers searching the gap between the warped floorboards beneath the bed. Her skin snagged on splinters until she felt the sharp, jagged edge of a broken pallet, a fragment Eli had overlooked in his rage. She reached under the mattress and pulled out a single, crumpled sketch that had survived the fire. Turning it over to the blank side, she gripped the shard of wood. With frantic, desperate strokes, she began to etch a message into the paper, the wood scarring the fibers. She didn't use words. She used the symbols they had practiced. The shorthand for the shelter, the time of the morning service, and the signal for the final move. Her hands shook, but she didn't stop until the map of their escape was carved into the page. Janice lurched out of a thick chemical haze as a blinding beam of light pierced her eyelids, searing her vision. Eli stood over her, his flashlight a miniature sun. With one violent motion, he ripped the wool blanket from her body, leaving her exposed and shivering on the sweat-soaked mattress. The air in the room was a cocktail of fresh shoe polish and Eli's aggressive, spicy cologne. He threw a bundle of fabric onto the foot of the bed, her heavy, starched Sunday dress, which hissed like a snake as it landed. The chill of the room bit into Janice's damp skin. Eli barked an order to dress, his voice bouncing off the boarded-up windows like a trapped bird. Janice's teeth began to chatter, a frantic percussion in the stifling, artificial dark of the room. Eli slammed a heavy plate of food onto the oak table, the ceramic ringing out like a bell. A slab of overcooked beef sat in a pool of congealing gray fat, emitting a heavy, cloying steam. He slid a glass of cloudy water toward her and then moved behind her chair, his large hands clamping onto her shoulders. Janice felt his thumbs dig into her collarbones, a tactile reminder of who owned her movements. He stood there, a silent sentinel, monitoring the path of every forkful. The meat felt like a wad of dry wool in Janice's throat, nearly impossible to swallow. Eli leaned down, his hot breath ruffling the fine hairs on her neck, watching her until the last scrap of food had been forced down her throat. Janice reached behind her back, her fingers fumbling with the heavy folds of her silk skirt, as if she were merely adjusting the fit. Her hand slipped into a secret slit she had painstakingly cut into the lining days ago. She felt the rough, sandpaper texture of a small, primed scrap of canvas. She pressed the fabric against her ribs, the sharp whalebone of her corset biting into her skin to hold the secret in place. The jagged edge of the canvas scratched her flesh, a stinging sensation she welcomed because it felt like reality. Every breath she took resulted in the protest of strained threads. Beneath the layers of lace and propriety, the hidden evidence of their rebellion pulsed against her skin, a secret armor that felt stronger than anything Eli could wield. Eli dipped his thumb into a jar of thick, peach-colored concealer and smeared it across Janice's cheekbone with the force of a man sanding wood. He worked the pigment into the edges of the bruise, obliterating the evidence of his own hand. Janice remained motionless, her eyes fixed on a water stain on the wallpaper, while Eli's rough touch remodeled her face. The scent of floral powder filled her nose, mixing with the faint, lingering smell of old blood. He reached for a string of heavy pearls and snapped the clasp shut around her neck. The cold stones felt like a noose, restricting her windpipe. Eli stepped back to admire his handiwork, and Janice saw a stranger in the mirror. A waxy, porcelain doll trapped in a cage of jewelry and lies. Eli's fingers closed around Janice's wrist like a pair of iron manacles, and he hauled her across the threshold of the house. The gravel of the driveway crunched under his heavy soles, a sound that drowned out Janice's light, shuffling steps. At the gate, a dozen flashbulbs erupted, peppering Janice's vision with white dancing spots. Reporters shouted questions into the humid air, but Eli only tightened his grip, pulling Janice's elbow flush against his ribs to project an image of a devoted couple. A black polished sedan waited at the curb, smelling of sun-warmed leather and gasoline. Eli shoved her into the sweltering interior, and the heavy thud of the door closing severed the noise of the crowd, leaving her alone with his unblinking, predatory stare. In the cramped, shadowed space behind the stage, the air tasted of ancient dust and candle wax. Eli shoved Janice into a corner where the heavy velvet curtains swallowed the light. Her back hit the rough brick wall with a jarring thud. He loomed over her, his face a mask of the performative holiness he was about to show the town. He leaned in, his voice a low, vibrating hiss as he spoke of the white, sterilized walls of the state asylum and the smell of bleach that would become her entire world if she dared to falter. Janice felt a single bead of sweat track down her spine under the restrictive corset. Eli adjusted his cuffs, giving her one final, glacial look before he stepped out into the brilliance of the stage lights. Claire's shadow moved through the racks of hanging choir robes, as silent as a draft. She stopped at the edge of the vanity, and her eyes, wide and luminous with terror, met Janice's in the mirror's reflection. Claire gave a microscopic tilt of her head toward the heavy oak doors that led into the sanctuary. Janice caught the signal, a silent confirmation that Mrs. Watts, Sarah, and the others were already in their seats, their own secrets clutched in their laps. Claire vanished back into the shadows as quickly as she had appeared, leaving behind the faint, sharp scent of turpentine. Janice clenched her fists, feeling the plan they had whispered about in the annex finally taking on weight and form. Eli strode into the center of the stage, and a tidal wave of applause crashed over him. The spotlights caught the gold thread in his tie, turning him into a shimmering icon of authority. Janice remained in the darkness of the wings, her shoulder pressed against the dusty velvet. Through a gap in the curtain, she could see rows of politicians in charcoal suits and pews full of townspeople whose faces were a blur of adoration. The roar of the crowd died down as Eli raised his hands, a gesture that commanded the very air to go still. Janice stood in the gloom, feeling the vibration of his power humming through the floorboards and into the soles of her shoes. A countdown to the end. Eli's voice shifted into that deep, honeyed baritone that had always been his greatest weapon. Janice heard him speak of the sanctity of the home, calling her his anchor in a world drowning in sin. The words submission and grace fell from his lips like polished stones. A collective sigh of appreciation rippled through the audience. Beneath her makeup, Janice's skin burned with the shame of his lies. He painted a picture of their life that was a masterpiece of deception, and every compliment felt like a fresh bruise. Janice closed her eyes, imagining the sound of that perfect voice cracking and splintering when the truth was finally dragged into the light. Janice dropped her hand to her waist, her fingertips finding the stiff, sharp edge of the hidden canvas through the silk of her gown. The corner bit into her skin, a physical promise of the coming storm. She took a ragged breath, filling her lungs with the stale, overheated air of the backstage, and felt the corset strain against her ribs. Her knees felt like water, but she forced her weight onto her heels, anchoring herself to the stage. Images of her destroyed paintings and Claire's ruined arms flashed through her mind. The fear that had paralyzed her for nearly 2 decades suddenly crystallized into a cold, sharp-edged resolve. She squared her shoulders, the silk of her dress pulling taut against the new, dangerous strength she was harboring. Eli turned toward the wings, a wide, triumphant smile stretching across his face. With a theatrical flourish, he gestured for Janice to join him, his voice booming as he announced the name of his virtuous and beloved wife. Janice saw him reach out, his hand open and expectant, waiting for her to play her part in his grand finale. The gold trophy on the pedestal gleamed under the lights, a monument to his ego. Janice stepped forward, and the spotlights hit her eyes like a physical blow, turning the world into a featureless white void. Eli gave her a small, knowing wink, utterly convinced of his victory, as Janice emerged from the shadows with the weapon hidden against her heart. Janice walked out onto the stage, the heat of the lamps pressing against her skin like a fever. Hundreds of eyes locked onto her, expectant and hungry for the performance of a perfect life. Eli stood frozen, his hand still extended in the air, his gold rings catching the light as he waited for Janice to take her place. Janice didn't look at his hand. She didn't look at him at all. Instead, she stared straight into the black void of the cameras. With a sudden, violent wrench, she grabbed the side of her silk gown. The fabric, once her pride, groaned and then gave way with a sound like a gunshot. The silk ripped from her hip to her waist, the noise echoing through the sudden, shocked silence of the church. Janice didn't flinch as the torn lining fell away, revealing the pale curve of her waist and the edge of the bundle she had carried like a secret child. She reached into the jagged tear and pulled out the roll of canvas. Eli made a sudden, lunging move toward her, his face darkening into a mask of purple rage, but Janice was faster. She grabbed the top edge and snapped the canvas open. The heavy linen unfurled with a sharp, rhythmic crack. The smell of oil paint and mineral spirits billowed out, sharp enough to cut through the scent of lilies and floor wax. Janice thrust the painting high above her head, tilting it so the spotlights could devour the image. The television crews reacted instinctively, their lenses zooming in on the raw, wet colors that Janice had bled onto the fabric. The painting was a nightmare rendered in oil. It wasn't a landscape. It was a portrait of Eli in the middle of a private, holy rage. His face on the canvas was a distorted mess of teeth and fury, his eyes devoid of anything human. In the foreground, Janice had painted Claire. Not as the town saw her, but as she was behind closed doors. A broken, bruised thing huddled at the feet of a monster. Every purple-black mark on the girl's arms was rendered with a clinical, agonizing precision. The light of the church made the painted blood look wet, as if it were still dripping from the brush, a visceral scream captured in pigment. Eli lunged again, his massive hand clawing at the air, trying to shred the evidence of his soul. Janice spun away to the very edge of the stage, the heels of her shoes clicking precariously on the lip of the wood. Her voice, once a whisper, now cut through the room like a blade. She didn't plead. She recited facts. She shouted the addresses of the hidden shelters and the exact dollar amounts they had funneled away from his charity to buy the freedom of the broken. Eli stopped, his breath coming in ragged, animal grunts, as Janice laid bare the financial rot at the heart of his ministry. Each word she spoke was a hammer blow to his pedestal, and the town watched in a paralyzed, horrific fascination as their idol crumbled. Eli's hand finally found Janice's throat, his fingers squeezing until the world began to dim. The pearls around her neck snapped, the white stones scattering across the stage like hail. But as she gasped for air, a new sound rose from the pews. Claire stood up. She didn't say a word, but her movement was a tidal wave. She reached up and unbuttoned the heavy cardigan she had worn all summer, letting it fall to the floor. Under the bright, unforgiving lights, her arms were revealed, a roadmap of scars and fresh, angry welts. She stood there, a silent, bleeding monument to the truth. And for the first time in his life, Eli McCall looked at a woman and felt the first cold touch of genuine fear. Following Claire's lead, Mrs. Watts stood, her hand trembling as she pulled back her lace collar to show the thumbprints on her neck. Then Sarah stood, then Marilyn, until a dozen women were on their feet. They didn't shout. They simply bore witness with their bodies. Mrs. Watts's face was a mask of cold iron. Sarah's eyes were bright with a fire that had been suppressed for years. The silence in the church was no longer the silence of the grave. It was the silence of a fuse burning down. Janice felt Eli's grip go slack as he stared at the army of ghosts he had created, his power evaporating in the heat of their collective gaze. The sanctuary erupted into a chaotic, heaving mass of motion. The politicians, sensing the stench of a dying career, scrambled for the side exits, their faces hidden behind their hands. The rhythmic, mechanical click of the cameras intensified, a barrage of flashes that caught Eli in a dozen different poses of guilt. He looked around the room, his mouth working but no sound coming out, seeking a friendly face among the elders. But the men who had once toasted his success were now looking at the floor or the ceiling, anywhere but at the monster on the stage. The Grand Jubilee had become a public execution of his character, and there was no one left to save him. Janice took a final, steady step toward the man who had been her jailer for 20 years. She opened her hands, and the painting fell, landing on the floorboards with a dull thud, covering Eli's shoes in the image of his own depravity. She didn't look back to see his reaction. She turned her back on him, walking toward the edge of the stage with a stride that was long and sure. She jumped down into the aisle, and immediately, the women were there. Claire and Mrs. Watts reached out, their arms locking with hers to form a human chain. Janice felt the strength of their grip, a solid, living wall that no belt or fist could break. They walked together toward the great oak doors, leaving Eli alone in the center of a vanishing world. Eli tried to follow, his heavy boots thumping against the wood as he shouted her name, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate wail. But the path was blocked. The sheriff of Oak Creek, a man who had spent years looking the other way, stepped into the light. His face was set in a grim, uncompromising line. With the eyes of the world's media upon him, there was only one path left to take. He grabbed Eli's arms and spun him around with a force that sent the preacher's Bible skittering across the floor. The metallic snap of the handcuffs closing around Eli's wrists was the loudest sound in the room. The sheriff led the broken man away, and for the first time, the town saw Eli McCall for what he was. A small, frightened man in a cheap suit. Janice stepped out onto the church porch, the cool Arkansas night air rushing into her lungs. It tasted of rain and freedom, a sharp contrast to the stale, perfumed air of the sanctuary. At the bottom of the steps, Claire was already waiting by an old, dented station wagon. The girl didn't say a word, but her eyes were wet with tears of relief. She pressed a heavy ring of keys into Janice's hand. Janice looked through the window of the car and saw the back seat crammed with the remnants of her life. Canvases, tubes of paint, and a single suitcase. The engine was already humming, a steady, promising vibration. Janice slid into the driver's seat, her hands finding the wheel, and for the first time, she didn't look in the rearview mirror to see if she was being followed. The tires hummed against the asphalt as Janice drove, the dark woods of the Ozarks blurring past her windows. She crossed the state line just as the horizon began to bleed into a soft, bruised purple. The steeples and water towers of Oak Creek were nothing more than a memory in the fog. Janice reached into the glove compartment, pulled out a rough paper towel, and began to scrub at her face. She wiped away the layers of beige cream and floral powder until her real skin emerged, pale, scarred, but finally able to breathe. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman she hadn't met in 20 years. The road ahead was long and empty, and for the first time in her life, she was the one choosing the direction. The new studio was a cathedral of light, the walls white and smelling of fresh lime. Janice stood before a massive, unblemished canvas, the fabric tight and expectant. Outside the window, the sun was climbing over the mountains, casting long golden fingers across the floor. She picked up a wide brush, saturated it with a mixture of ochre and brilliant white, and made a single, bold stroke across the center of the void. The paint was thick and honest. In the bottom corner, she didn't write Mrs. McCall. She signed her name in a clear, sharp script that would never be erased. She was Janice Wilson, and she was finally home.